thank you all for joining us for IndiePie this month. It is August. We will be having a in-person hybrid event again coming up in September. So look for that. Make sure that's on your calendars. So let's get kicked off here. Welcome. IndiePie is celebrating 15 years. This is our 15-year anniversary. We started in 2007. Thanks to our loyal tribe of attendees and supporters. We'll continue the celebrations until April of 2023. So it is our 15-year birthday. It's kind of like your birthday month. We're going to celebrate the birthday year for IndiePie. We are also, each month we're hosting a hybrid event. So once a month or once a quarter, we'll do one hybrid event in the Indy area, so you can actually join us in person and actually have the folks who are online still join us online. So we did one of those already this year. I think it was a pretty good success. I was happy with the turnout, and I look forward to make sure we can cater to folks who are online and in person. So speaking of hybrid, mark your calendars. Next month, we'll be hosting our second hybrid meeting since the beginning of the pandemic. Join us. We're going to be at the IoT Lab in Fishers. So if you aren't familiar with the IoT Lab, it's close to Launch Fishers up here in downtown Fishers. And it's going to be a cool concept. We're going to have a panel discussion on, I'm calling it hot takes on CI tools we use. So if you are interested in how does AWS code pipeline compare to GitHub Actions, compare to Bitbucket pipelines, compare to GitLab, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm trying to amass as many developer advocates from those various products into one spot, and I will try and facilitate a panel discussion between them, and we will discuss the various CI tools in the DevOps environment. So definitely check that out. That will be at the IoT Lab, September 13th, 7 p.m. In person and hybrid, so you can join us online or in person. We will have both medias available for you. Make sure you're following us on Twitter. We are at IndiePie, and if you are live tweeting tonight's event, make sure you use the hashtag IndiePie, and that way we can help amplify those tweets and make sure we showcase them. But there will be live tweets going on during tonight's event on the IndiePie Twitter as well. So if you want to follow along, make comments about things, please feel free to do so there. I want to thank our sponsors. IndiePie is organized by 6 Feet Up. 6 Feet Up is a Python and cloud expert consulting company that helps innovative tech leaders build apps faster, innovate with AI and ML, simplify big data, and leverage cloud technology. We are committed to building a better world by using modern technologies and processes. In fact, our goal is to complete 10 impactful projects defined as impressive, purposeful, and transformative by 2025. So we're really hoping to make a difference in the world, and we're starting with IndiePie and helping organize and sponsor this. So glad you all are here with us. I am Calvin Hendricks Parker. If I didn't say that at the beginning, I co-founded 6 Feet Up in 1999 and have been the CTO ever since. I also want to thank our platinum sponsor, JetBrains. Stick around afterwards. We'll have some prizes, lovely prizes. There'll be a couple JetBrains PyCharm professional licenses that we will give away. I want to thank Reify Health and JFrog. JFrog is also giving away. Are we getting a prize from JFrog as well? Usually gives away some kind of Adafruit gadget, and so we will give away something from JFrog as well. Reify Health is looking for developers. So if you are looking for a new career, check out Reify Health. They've been awesome in sponsoring IndiePie, and I'm super excited to have them on board. If you would like to be on board, make sure you go to indiepie.org/become a sponsor, or email laura@6feetup.com, and we'll get you to be an awesome sponsor of IndiePie, and I'll say awesome things about you each month that I talk about you on IndiePie. So that's the big giant reward. Also doing well, doing good in our community. If you are looking for a job or a new career, not only is Reify Health probably hiring, but so are a bunch of people who are in this room are probably all hiring. Make sure you join our IndiePie Slack. There is a jobs channel in the IndiePie org, and we want to make sure that people can post their career opportunities. And if you're looking for a job, make sure you post in there. Say, hey, looking for, and whatever it is, somebody might be looking for that for you. So we want to make sure we get those people hooked up to each other. Lots of people have gotten great career opportunities from our community, and I want to make sure we continue that. We have moved meetingplace.io, if you haven't noticed. It's been like 3 years now, but there's still people who RSVP through meetup.com. But the official place to RSVP for IndiePie is meetingplace.io/IndiePie. And if you want to go claim your meetup.com profile over on Meetingplace, just use that URL and you will be able to basically slide right on in, and you'll be eligible for the door prizes, because I will do a live code after the speaker that based on the RSVPs from meetingplace.io. So if you want to be eligible for the door prizes tonight, make sure you are RSVP'd on meetingplace.io, and we will do our door prize drawing from there. All right, all that said, now is the moment you've all been waiting for. We have a guest speaker. Nick has joined us, a newly minted Chicagoan. What do people from Chicago call themselves?
That's a good question. I think you had a good answer. Chicagoan sounds good.
Chicagoan? All right, we're going to go with that. We're going to learn about emerging code risks of code writing ML models. I'm fully prepared for the Terminator to show up and take care of this problem. So Nick, I'll let you take it away.
All right, thanks. Let me.
Yeah, and if folks have questions, Nick will kind of have a pause halfway through for some general questions. But if there's something you just don't get, raise your hand, throw it in the Zoom chat or on Slack, and I'll bust in for you.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. I'll try to keep a few different windows open at the same time.
Yeah, I'll kind of watch for you just in case.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Nick. I'm a software engineer currently on the Determined AI team. That's an open source platform that's been acquired by HP Enterprise. Previously, I worked at the Museum of Modern Art and on some redistricting and open government projects. So a bunch of projects that I worked on in the past, but sort of more pivoting into this machine learning AI world. And over the course of the talk, I'm going to start out with what I hope is like a more practical and useful general conversation about like machine learning models. What do we mean by LLMs, or large language models? How they're being used to generate code, and how they can be trained on new tasks. And then, as we talked about before, in the middle, we'll have like a Q&A just about that. And then the thing that I'm sort of doing as my research project that later this week, I'm actually going to bring to the AI Village at the DEF CON conference is these risks to these code models, specifically the code models being trusting, name and license serving as a prompt, and searching for adversarial comments. So definitely, I would love to get questions and find out that there's something I need to change in the presentation for the next iteration or two. So all feedback welcome on this. So maybe you've heard about these coding AIs. I think the most common one is GitHub's Copilot, which is itself powered by OpenAI, I want to say Codex. So these are some different models that have come out very recently. Salesforce has something, Google has an internal project, Amazon just announced something called Code Whisperer. Does anyone have one that they're using now that isn't listed here? I don't know.
Oh, Nick, I'm too scared.
You're too scared? Okay. But one thing that's really kind of fascinating is GitHub is claiming that when you have Copilot in Visual Studio or wherever you have it enabled, they're saying 40% of the code is being suggested by Copilot. So a lot more code than you would think is being generated by these AI models right now. In fact, there could be somebody at your company who's relying on it and using it for predictions and sending their code over to Copilot as they work on it. And you've probably never talked about it as like a security issue or like how reliable is it? And I think the biggest misconception about how AI is getting better at English language text and code is that it's reading and understanding the text on like a human level. Like, I don't know if when you were in middle school and high school, you had to diagram a bunch of sentences, or you worked in code analysis before. There's this kind of idea of a static analysis where it's going to bring in the code and split it out into the compiler, split it out into functions and parameters and things. I think this is how people assume that AI is working, because there's tons of courses that people have been taking where they're parsing English sentences or they're parsing code. And there was sort of, that was like the previous generation of language understanding. Generation of it is all this pre-processing is making a lot of assumptions about what we need. Or, you know, if you're looking at text on Twitter, it's not always going to be a fully structured sentence. So what if you just got a lot of text? I don't want to say all the text on the internet, which is a lot of people claim, but as much text as you could reasonably index, and take all of that text And these large language models are processing it to develop sort of a general language model of, like, once it's finished training, it should have an understanding of when someone's talking about foods, these are foods. And when someone's talking about a particular place, they're talking about these things are connected to it. It's sort of, because it's seen more text than actually any of us have ever read, it's going to develop sort of a general model of language. So sort of the flow chart that I tried to put together here is you start out with all that text. There's a process called tokenization, which kind of like the intro level would be that it splits it into words, but it's actually using subwords. Like if you have like prefixes and suffixes, then it's going to be splitting those out so it has like some semantic meaning to it. And there's some other languages where it's not so easy to split it up into tokens, but it's basically split up into these words or subword pieces, and then those are turned into a vector. And the reason we're trying to do this is that transformer models are really good at processing vectors, and sort of the advancement was understanding this transformer architecture, understanding these other architectures of machine learning model, and then finding out a way to get text that could be different lengths or just any text that you find on the internet, sort of crunching it down into a machine learning problem that can be done with vector math. And before we were talking about like DALL-E and some other models, those are also transformer models. They bring in some additional media into this process, but it's the same idea. You get as much data as possible, you split it up into pieces that can be turned into this continuous training process. And then the end result model could be used for a lot of different things. So Stanford has a paper calling these foundation models. I think that might, if any part of this seems very complicated, just think we're trying to find a foundation model that knows everything there is to know about English, or read all of the code on GitHub and knows everything about code, or, that's the end game of this, making a large language model is many gigabytes in size. It's very complex. You've shown it all as much text as possible, and then the end result will give you a model that could be usable for future tasks. So once you have one of these models, how can you train it? Or what are tasks that you would even want to train on? So typical tasks that people are talking about are like translating from one language to another, detecting spam or toxic comments. If you have a bunch of news articles that have come in to some sort of feed, you're trying to sort them out into what topics they belong to. Really any sort of problem where you might want to look at a bunch of text and say, I think the stock is going to go up, or anything like that, you can generalize into a language problem. You're going to want to use one of these large language models. They perform a lot better than previous methods that were trying to parse the words more deliberately and like I was talking about earlier. So there are three ways that you can train a language model onto a new task. Sort of the most common one that if you're taking like a class on this that they'll cover is fine tuning. And what does it mean to fine tune? It means that you start training again on the examples that are specific to your tasks. So for a translation task, you would go to some human people that know both languages and say, I want you to give me thousands of examples of this translation process. And then I'm going to continue training the model on that. And so the next time it sees English text, it's going to know what I want to do is translate to Spanish or the reverse or something like that. So that's the most common one and probably what makes the most sense, because you have a general language model and then you task it with something new. The second one is relatively new and it's called prompting or prompt engineering. The idea is if this language model really understands code, maybe I could just show it the code and then write a comment that says, this code should be rewritten as this, and then ask it to rewrite that code. Let's say you give it a Python function and say, please rewrite this to JavaScript, then it would create a JavaScript function. The idea being that because it will understand your instructions, that you don't have to train it on thousands of examples to give it just one task. And the reason people are really excited about this and making larger and larger models to get to this point is because then instead of training a new model for every individual task, you can have something like GPT-3 or the GitHub Copilot example that are a huge model sitting on a server somewhere, and whatever people are throwing at it, it is going to read the question or instructions and try to come up with a reasonable answer, and instead of them trying to deploy many hundreds or thousands of these models. And so that's good both for like a technical perspective. You don't have to host models for every individual user, but also from like a profitability perspective where you're going to be like, I'm going to hold on to this model and like profit from API access or something like that. And then the third method I just listed because I don't know a whole lot about it, but the newest research, people seem to be doing reinforcement learning to make the models better on a specific task. This actually works really well for code because they just tell the model to generate many hundreds or thousands of programs, and then they can quickly, run the program and find out whether it worked or not, and get that immediate feedback to improve the model. So 3 very different approaches. I feel like prompting is the most common one and most relevant to the coding. And a prompt could just be something like the first half of your code, or like you write. The example I usually show people when I'm doing this in code is I write a comment that says return area of a circle, and then Python I write def area of circle parens r for radius, and then complete the code. So old code completion would be like, what are you trying to do? This kind of model, it reads your comment, it reads the function, it reads that I added the radius variable, and it says, oh, okay, to complete the function, I need to write return math.py times r star 2 or something like that. So that's just like so it's sort of this prompting idea that started out with like a language thing of like asking it to do a particular task has become this idea of we send Copilot our partially completed code, and then it sends back how it thinks we should complete the code. And when we're talking about these outputs of these models, they're not just like telling us this is the answer, I'm the all-powerful, knowledgeable model. Instead, it has a probability. And I think this is really helpful to understand because there isn't always one answer to how to write a function or how to write really anything. So this is an example I give where the prompt is, Jamie is a student. Every day she wakes up and goes to. So what are some answers that could be after this?
School.
Right, school is an example. Can someone think of another one?
Work.
Goes to work could be one.
Hospital.
Hospital, goes to get
The
breakfast
library.
or something. So these are all very, very valid answers. And it's like, well, any of those, how do you turn this into something where the model is going to return one answer, or the model is going to return sort of a probability distribution of possible answers? So in this case, this is using GPT-2. So it's not as powerful as GPT-3 and whatever. But anyway, so the word that it suggested was school, and it says 53% likelihood to say school, and then it has class, work, it's continuing the sentence in some way with the, her, or every day she wakes up and goes to bed. Like, I feel like it's a little bit depressing, but 2.67% at that level. So this is using a library called Echo, ECCO, and this is really cool for me because you can look at any layer of the model and any token that is generated and figure out what were the other options that it could have generated. Sort of the classic debiasing example would be, with student or teacher, like looking at the token for he or she and figuring out, does it think that what it knows about the person so far is like determining their gender or something like that. You can look at different things about what the model currently thinks about the sentence at that point in time as it's going from first to last. Here's another example. I don't know what the original sentence was, but based on the tokens that it's suggesting as the next word, we can probably guess that it's looking for a city in the UK. And compared to previously, where there was like a really strong like majority response for school, here the answer is less clear of what should be the right answer. So there's a whole subfield, whole mini science about when you have these probabilities, what should you do? So the greedy decoding is you should just always take the highest scoring word over and over and over again. The sampling idea is that you should take these probabilities and take a draw to randomly decide which one of those is correct based on this probability space. So 10% of the time you'll get London, and 4.4% of the time you'll get Manchester. So this means you could generate a lot of really different branching sentences with sampling, even with the exact same starting sentence. And I think that's true of just how English language works. And then there are people who are also working with something called beam search, which my understanding of beam search, which I'm not an expert on this, is that it looks beyond this first word and starts looking at, okay, what are the next words I might say after this, to build like a more complete idea of like which probable path it should take. And then there's some more recent research papers called typical decoding and rank gen. It's very frustrating when you get a paper and they call something typical decoding and you're like, well, what does that mean? It's just they sort of decided to call it that. It doesn't really inform. But the idea behind these papers is they believe that in natural human language, there's sort of a pace to how often we share new information versus basic information, and that they can somehow choose probabilities based on that. And they have some really interesting results where they show people the output of models that are using greedy, sampled, and typical decoding, and people are preferring their method as like the more human, natural text. So it's sort of, we're still exploring exactly what it means for these words to have these probabilities. I agree that this is very confusing, but the main thing I want you to take away from is you could choose the most popular word all the time and get the same response each time, or you could kind of assume the probabilities are helpful and sample across that probability space to sort of create a branching path of what you're going to answer for this. And yeah, as you take each word or token and add it to your sentence, you're creating more and more choices, and it affects what the next word will be in the next word. And so it's very difficult to say from the start, like what something is going to become. And it's really actually quite amazing that people are able to generate meaningful text or meaningful code based on this sort of path through the many probability waves of our language. So let's have a quick check-in in case, like, is there something you want me to explain differently, go back to, and sort of sort out how did we get these words from the model?
I thought it was interesting during dinner when we were talking about the Wall-E generated pictures. Like once the other son asked, why don't you get the same picture every time you put the same words in? But it sounds like this probability, generates new options all the way along.
Yeah, I think what happens with Dolly is they start out with some random noise, and then, not to use the CSI example, but they're like enhance, make it more and more like this prompt. And it's like, how am I? It's just like it's rather frustrated because it starts out with like nothing.
Yeah.
But then based on where it initially starts placing things, it can build that into something. So it used to be when there was like a open source model that worked very slowly, in like the first couple iterations, you would see kind of a fuzzy picture emerging and you'd be like, is this what I want or not? Should I start over?
Yeah. No, I think to explain it to those kids, I think actually they understand it already. They know that there's a seed phrase for Minecraft generation.
Oh.
And so they can reproduce a specific world by reproducing the same seed. But if you randomize the seed, it still generates a world, but it's always different.
Mm.
So that's that fuzziness I think you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the fuzziness of it is really fascinating. And it's also kind of, you can also understand why just having it be totally based on probability wouldn't be so great, because maybe 1 in 1,000 times
You get weirdness.
yeah, you'd say Jamie wakes up and goes to applesauce, and you'd be like, well, that doesn't make sense. Like that, there's a reason why that is such a small probability. So it's like, okay, we're going to choose the probability out of the first like top 20, or like, and this is something that's been explored a lot in English, but I really know next to nothing about how people are decoding probability in code, because they're sort of just really psyched that they can generate code right now that works. And I haven't seen somebody saying, oh, here's a method that generates cleaner code or more probabilistic code or anything like that.
So I had a question, unless anybody else wants to bust in first, but I'm going to go ahead since I'm here. What is really the difference between, the concept of genetic programming, where a program is modifying itself, running against a test, and then hoping to succeed or score the best score, as opposed to like reinforcement learning, where you're given like punishment and reward, I assume, for the function performing in a certain way?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't done really much with reinforcement learning, so I think that they're closer related than you're kind of putting it. Because I think with reinforcement learning, you are, you are generating a lot of different versions of it, and then saying,
similar.
The idea, I think, with reinforcement learning, as I understand it, is you're saying that there's the factors that you can control, kind of like with Go or chess, the factors that you can control do not immediately turn into like you won or you lost. So it's very unclear what combination of things, or like I make this change now, and then 3 steps later, that really helps or hurts me. So I would say that reinforcement learning is that idea of it's trying to seek out ways that it's planning ahead. It's also very computationally expensive, in that like it's only very higher up research labs that are trying to do this on these really huge models. Whereas I guess to compare it to the more typical language models, the more typical language models are just, they're going through all of that text, and each time they see a new word, they're like, how well did I predict this next word was going to be what came up? And if the probability was 100%, then it's like nailed it. Probability was 50-50, then it's like, okay, maybe I'll tweak the probability of this word to be more popular because I missed it. And then if the probability was like really small, then it's like, okay, I need to move it back to, I need to somehow change the neural model so that this word would be more probable to have come up where it did. So they're really like not teaching to the test. They're basically that you get that data, and they're trying to tune its generator to generate more text like that. So in that case, it's not really doing anything too creative, but it's trying to sort of develop this model of what's the real world probability of this word appearing there.
Yeah. We had one question from the audience, which was, are these search apps? Are they strategies? Is it something else? But in their case, we're talking about like predicting what's coming next.
Yeah, in this case, I think you were asking about this step, which these are called decoders, or decoding, because you have a probability vector and you're trying to turn that into just one word, or decode it into one word. So that you have the question of which word is it and which one do you choose?
Cool.
Risks of the source data being biased. Okay, I have that window there. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll talk about this a little bit, but especially when this has been more studied with the English language text, but just because of let's say that you were training your model on Reddit. So I've trained a model on Reddit. I trained it on the Ask NYC model so that you can like ask it questions about New York, and it gives you very, very, very funny answers usually. But it's based on whatever the community that's in the Ask NYC Reddit is. So you're going to get, first, if you ask where should I go, where should I stay, it's going to be biased to particular neighborhoods where those users live. And I mean, Reddit sort of as far as I know, very white male demographic. So sort of biases towards answers that are more like that. I've seen some really interesting, like the questions that are on our Ask NYC can be very diverse. There was somebody who, there was an Ask NYC Reddit question that, this is from several years ago, so it's nothing to do with me or my model, but this is like, I was looking through my questions to say, how, if someone doesn't know about Reddit, how can I find some examples of questions people have asked? And someone would ask like, oh, I'm a Nigerian Muslim woman, where is a good place that I can go to mosque or something? And that's something that is very difficult to kind of Google. And then there would be somebody on the Ask NYC Reddit who would be like, oh, I do this, or my friend does this. And it feels good to get an answer from another human. So how about we create an AI that replaces that human? Maybe not that great, but what I want to say is the Ask NYC Reddit is not a toxic place, but I can understand why it would be easy to evaluate it and say, you know, even though they answer questions for a lot of people from a lot of different walks of life, the majority, especially if you're doing this most common answer thing here, the majority is not representative of like the whole city and all the knowledge that people have. I hope that answers it, because I mean, this is something that like people are actually researching who like spend a lot of time getting PhDs and stuff, but I'm trying to say it in a very general term, how I feel about that.
Awesome. Anybody else got a question? I think we're good to move forward.
Cool. So I should show some more Python code because I showed the Echo example. So here's an example with the HuggingFace transformers library. If these slides go out, you'll be able to get the collab link. So when we ask the model to generate text, we're sending in the any words that have come before, like the Jamie is a student kind of initial content. We ask it how many words or tokens to generate, in this case 50. If you want to do beam search, you have to send a number. Early stopping is like a more technical thing. Do sample is to do that, selecting from the probability space, true or false. Typical P is a parameter that is somehow how the typical decoding works. And then repetition penalty, this is really important and valuable because often the easiest thing to do when you're generating text is to just keep repeating the same things over and over again, because you already know the person said it. And so this repetition penalty will nudge it away from this kind of unnaturally repeating text. And one reason I kind of have been talking to the HuggingFace people like a month ago, and I've never gotten around to it, but I really want to do something about this, is there's so many ways you could decode text, and they're all going through this same function. And there's these limits on what the parameters can, or the arguments of the function can be. And any additional arguments, like if you misspell typical P as one word or something, those go to KW args and get passed to the model without it like flagging it as an error. So there's actually a lot of cases where you could make a small mistake on this generate function and think that you're doing beam search or something. And actually, because these parameters interacted in a certain way, or you spelled something wrong, you just silently are choosing a different method than what you expected. So I don't know if the most Pythonic way to do it would be to create like a separate function for each decoder, or to raise errors if you chose a combination that doesn't really work. Right now, it just sort of silently chooses the option that it chooses. And I tried to do some logging and things like that. And they said, oh, well, people aren't really looking at the logs and stuff. So this is something where if you want to write some very niche Python code, or tell me how to do some Python code, I could really use some feedback on this, I guess. But something to keep in mind. And before I get into like the risks, which is kind of like the core of like, you know, the headline of the whole talk, right? The risks, emerging risks of code models. I want to acknowledge that the code models take a lot of hard work and they solve real problems. Like I've used it a few times to kind of test it out. So I don't want to say, oh, how could they do this? How could they release this or anything? Like these are really much better than any like code completion tools that ever existed before. Kind of crazy to think about. And none of them are going to be like red alert security issues. I'd hope that just like the previous content, it'll help demystify what's going on inside the machine learning model and make people interested about having some sort of security mindset around this. And first thing is that when you sign up for GitHub Copilot, they ask you to select your preferences, and they say, oh, GitHub Copilot can allow our block suggestions matching public code. So I chose the most permissive model in this. So, I mean, hashtag no judgment. But basically, they're telling you GitHub knows all of the open source public code on GitHub. Is that cool? And can GitHub look at my own code for product improvements? And I mean, considering this is a very controversial thing, I think it was very helpful that they have this up front and that the FAQs answer a lot probably have about this. But it is fair to say that people who are, if you've written open source code that's public on GitHub, it's fair to say that GitHub Copilot has read it and it has like some factor in like influencing how other people get responses from GitHub Copilot. And so like some of the deeper questions people have about this was, is that plagiarism to look at everybody's code? Like can GPT or GPL licensed code like count as plagiarism? Because it's really looked at everything, just like we've looked at GPL. Like if people on this call, if you've looked at GPL licensed code, I mean, you didn't have to like delete it from your brain afterward when you worked on like internal code. So I think that arguing that just seeing this code as plagiarism is sort of opening up a big ball of worms towards like saying like, because I think you have, if you want to say something's plagiarizing something else, you have to like find specific things that match, is what I'm saying. Otherwise, you're arguing that if anyone sees like conventional material at your work, then you can never talk about that again because it's in your brain or something. You can't have derivative works that are in the same space. I think that kind of a more complex question is whether learning these probabilities to make human sounding text, whether that's intelligence or whether that's a science, because it sort of developed this model and it works really well, but it's hard to say that like it would know the difference between writing good code or bad code. Or if you told it like, is it safe for me to write this code for my robot to use these like power saws in the car factory? It wouldn't really be like, oh, no, that sounds like a terrible idea. Instead, it would be like, oh, here's somebody who did something like that. Like it's sort of like traveling through that code, that learned code without really having like a human interest in where that came from or why people do things.
But Nick,
yeah.
do you think that the Copilot could be gamed like Tay, the AI from Microsoft, was gamed?
So that's definitely something people like are definitely trying to do or thinking about. What I would say is that like there's that original step where they're training the model on all of the code on GitHub or whatever. My thought is that most likely they did that training and then they stopped training. Like, I don't think that if you, like, it's collecting examples that you're doing right now, but I don't think that like tomorrow it's not continuously doing that. Like maybe like Copilot 2 will be trained on your like trying to mess with the model. But I don't know this for a fact, but based on how other models have been deployed, they don't have it constantly like updating itself and its mindset.
Yeah, and I wonder if they also weighted based on like stars and forks and things like that.
That would be interesting to see. I think the reason they probably don't is just because they need so much content. Like compared to the amount of English text there is in the world, the amount of code in the world, you'd think it's all the code on GitHub would be a lot, but it needs to have as many examples of different code as possible. And I think they probably almost couldn't throw anything out. And what was I going to say about this is people have seen examples where if you try to get Copilot to develop like an example would be a list of countries. There's certain trigger words that like people are saying, well, first there are like actual trigger words and slurs and things that Copilot knows it doesn't want to generate or generate content after that. And so those are blocked. More controversial is this idea that if you're making a list of countries and that's politically controversial or writing about specific people, there are definitely words that people have noticed that Copilot stops recommending new code afterward. And so if you tried to like come up with the most offensive things possible and tell Copilot, oh, generate this after every code, it's already filtering those out. Like it already knows not to like play along with you on that. But of course you could find, as if you're on social media and people get through the content filters, people are always looking for more and more disturbingly creative ways to defeat content filters. So I'm sure they're looking into it. They've already disabled some particular words that were concerning.
Yeah, and one more question from the audience was, if it's you gave it half a method from a GPL repo and it completes that in a very similar way to the GPL repo, isn't it arguable that that some encoded copy of the GPL is in here?
I think so. I mean, you could definitely make that argument. And the thing is, like when you go to legal arguments about code, like the judge often will look at the code side by side and say like the variable names look the same. Like this was like the Oracle, Google, Java question. So I guess if you were going to talk about plagiarism, would you generate the exact same code and see if it fills it in exactly the same way? Or would you change the variable names and see if it uses the same, like it like has a concept of that encoded and then says, okay, I'm going to code it exactly like that. I think you could definitely bait it into doing that. The problem being that they have gone through this generalized process that it would be impossible for it to remember everything. Like the whole point of it going through this process was to try to form a general model. So it's less likely that it would produce a long string of code that's exactly similar to what it's seen. But I'm sure that people can find examples of it doing this. I guess I don't have it here, but I listed somewhere people who have very specific like niche code that they're working on, like they have an Arduino that does this particular task. They have found like their usernames and URLs and things generated by Copilot, which is definitely something they don't want to do. Like they should back away from that. Yeah, and then the GPL thing, I do wonder if they make a Copilot 2, or maybe this is something they've already considered, is somehow like any repo that specifically says that it's GPL licensed, avoiding that. But if I have a comment on my repo that says this is GPL licensed, do they have to like read that and understand that? Or are they specifically looking for the GPL license? I think that, well, also people are asking us about DALL-E and reading all the images. I think that basically there's no existing legal argument that says that the ML model learned specifically from another individual. I'm sure this could be somebody's going to go to court about this with the images or the text or something. But I think that I mean, how many cases have you even heard about people successfully getting like code plagiarism like litigated in court? I mean, I think that it's a very uphill battle to say that the model not just learned from it, but is deliberately like copying and profiting from it. Let me just go through these examples here. So with the English text examples, some of the largest problems we talked about, very toxic and biased text. People are working on ways that maybe could debias. There's something I worked on with Spanish text where every text that you bring in that you're training on, you either keep it as it is or you flip the grammatical gender of that sentence within the structure of Spanish language. I know there's some non-binary Spanish language concepts that are being developed, but just as a proof of this particular axis of debiasing, I think people are familiar with visual deepfakes, but the deepfake that you could make something look like an authentic New York Times article or from a particular author, more convincing spam, political models. I think people were really worried that even GPT-2 was going to cause this, and so I don't know that this is coming about, but people were fearful that like the GPT models were going to learn everything about you and particular political issue and sort of write, essays and essays and essays that would like be targeted at your personal interests and why you should adopt that political view. So that would be kind of scary and annoying to get campaign messages all the time, but we'll see if that comes about. I think the main thing though is that because they're sort of generating this text without like a human mindset, you would have to specifically list and evaluate every negative output. So some of the more interesting rules that I've seen are like, don't give legal advice, don't give medical advice. Because if you're a chatbot at a bank and you start telling people, like you should take a Tylenol or something like that, that could lead to so many weird consequences and legal consequences for the company when it's like, you're a bank bot, you should never be giving anybody medical or legal advice. Also, there's DALL-E has these different restrictions to prevent people from generating violent content or political content. People have been trying like misspelling things or getting around the filter. One of the more gruesome filters that people have that get around the filter is saying not blood, but puddle of red liquid. So they're able to create some disturbing images with DALL-E just by sort of not talking about what it is, but then letting the model sort of generate that anyway. Sort of the best ways that people can improve these models are also very strange. Like instead of finding better and better quality content, instead you take the text and you change the label between spam and content, or you take the data and you just flip random words. And you would say, well, that would make it not a valid sentence, or that would make it more difficult. But by making these tasks more difficult for the computer, that somehow is improving its training, like it's looking for more signals because you're disrupting some of the signals. So it has to look for as many signals as possible to get the right answer. I mean, there's different theories about this, but rather than it being a system where we find quality content and then you tell the bot, don't harm people, here are the 3 laws of robotics, and it performs at the quality that you give it. Instead, there's all these little levers and knobs and tweaks that you can do to make the model better that are always surprising people and always a little bit worrisome to think that, what isn't getting caught, what is still going through. And then I think sort of its own point, which we can't really get into here, is that there's nowhere near the amount of content for even very commonly spoken languages like Arabic on the public internet that you could make. Like the GPT-3 model is generated on so much content that it's hard to figure out how we could make an Arabic GPT-3 without like somebody like downloading all of the Facebook messages in the world or something. It's very hard to get this enough content for the model to learn something. And that's why people are really drawn to doing this experimenting in English language, and the models in other languages are not being as invested in, or it's hard to know how we would ever really invest enough content from the internet alone. I think that's a good point to make, just from the internet alone, to get those models to the quality that other people could have the same benefits from these models. Is image data handled? Yeah, so with image data, like there's actually an example where they have an apple and they put a sticker on it that says iPod, and the model would read it and say, oh, this is an iPod, even though as a human you look at it and you say. So basically there are different tests people have done to see that image models were reading text inside of the image. And so there's different ideas about scrambling it, or I think somebody came up with a model that was able to pass that test and things like that. There's like always these different things where, because it's not perceiving it in the way that we're perceiving it, you might think that it's a solved issue until somebody comes up with an example where you're like, oh, I never thought about that. Yeah, so specifically about code models, I mean, first I would like to say the language models, there's a lot of papers about this. I, in the description, mentioned the Stochastic Parrots paper, which people were like fired from Google. I get a brief mention in the acknowledgements of the paper. That's like my claim to fame on that. So I think this is a real concern and issue, and you can approach it from a philosophy angle. You can approach it from a very like numerical, quantitative, how can I debias this model angle? Like no matter what your angle is, I think that you can get some really interesting research into this space. And it's going to be a lot of very painful and embarrassing things for companies that rush these language models into production. With the code models, this has been less researched. Like I mentioned before, coders are finding their own code usernames and URLs in these generated prompts, and or no, not in the generated code. And they're like, well, does that mean that it's stealing? Does that mean that it's sort of learning too much about me and my content? And I don't know if there's what the right way is for people to sort of express their interest in that. This is a tweet from a researcher who was looking at, independent researcher who was looking at GPT-J. This is a project mostly based in Europe to make an open source version of the OpenAI GPT-3 model. And they were saying, you know, it's looking at the whole internet, it's going to learn how to write code as well. And so just like on Stack Overflow, there would be an excerpt of code and then some text writing the code was wrong, and then writing some additional code after. So rather than learning, given a code problem, I should solve the code problem, instead it was saying, oh, this reminds me of a Stack Overflow thread. Let's make a thread that looks like Stack Overflow. And that's just a strange way to handle it, because if you just generated the first part, you might think that it's generating good code, but instead it's generating like another example of like a code, like help my code is broken question. Like it's not going to fully understand unless it's been trained on this specific use case of please help my code, rather than like imitating examples of code that you have seen on the internet. Sorry, I was phrasing that in a weird way. Does this part make sense that it's copying Stack Overflow like format?
I think I was thoroughly enjoying the fact that it would do that, you know, without thinking about it.
Yeah, my theory, my side theory is that these models really are sentient, and they're just mocking us by being like, oh, I don't understand, I'm just creating a Stack Overflow post. Or someone created like a, you know, the New York Times column, like Modern Love thing. So they created like a Modern Love scenario where like, I don't know, this, the way that they wrote the column, I was like, is this model mocking us? Like, do they know what's going on? And they're just sort of doing post-human satire. But yeah, it's you have to be very delicate to make sure that it generates the correct thing. I don't understand the question about the PEP filter. I don't understand that question. Oh, like Python style.
Yeah, if you wrote good style code, does that count more toward the model than if you write sloppy spaghetti code? Does it know?
Yeah, I think it makes a big difference. In this thread, this person was talking about like bad code generates more bad code, and good code generates more good code. I have an example later on where this will be very concerning. But yeah, I mean, for example, at work, I use like the type hints now in Python. And I think that's a very important variable for when you're generating code. I think it would generate very different code based on whether it knows you're one of the people that uses typing or not. Even though that shouldn't really matter in terms of like the code and how it compiles, it sort of compares you to code that other people using that format have done. So, I mean, specifically on the code styling thing, I mean, there have been programs for a very long time that like you can automatically do like make format on my system anyway, and it'll like adapt things to the right spacing and things like that. So people are still doing that for like the without an AI, they're able to style and format things properly. But I do think that the AI is learning something based on you styling things in a particular way. And it's hard to really know what that would mean. Like maybe it doesn't mean anything because it sees, 1,000 files like this and 1,000 files like that. And it's just not it just knows, oh, this person wants to keep writing type hints. But you also never really know what it learned from that. And I think you had a point about what maybe that's like a quality thing where like this person's working in the industry environment, or they have to make sure that everything's typed or something. But yeah, I have a couple more points about that.
Something that I found, but I've actually played with it quite extensively, and also actually, but it's only for personal stuff because it's not allowed as part by the company yet, and may not ever.
Yeah. So like they specifically said to not use it.
Yeah, I mean it's
Okay.
actually a bit. We have quite strict requirements there anyway. So yeah, that is, and I would actually be surprised if there will be many companies who would allow it, because there is actually one other reason. What I found is it does not. If you don't know the language or if you don't know the domain, it can actually be dangerous, because if you don't understand what the suggestions do, you may end up with very expensive code. Like when I played around, I tried, like, prompted it to say generate a Lambda function that does say looks up a user in a DynamoDB, and it created a table scan instead of a query. And with anybody obviously who knows AWS, if you use a table scan in a DynamoDB, if you have a large database, that could get quickly very expensive and also slow. So yeah, unless you know this and simply just, oh yeah, it looks reasonable, paste, right? And it's, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That would be really concerning if like there's costs that come from that. And especially because you're talking about it's in like a particular tool. Like I think that this would be really helpful for generating code that tends to be very repetitive, like this example, most frequent words, or if you're generating, especially Python and JavaScript code where they have lots of examples. But if you were writing something in another language, which has less content to go on, or it's like using this particular language in this particular product, and then also what you're talking about is like the coding efficiency, where that's an example a human coder could make if they just weren't very skilled at that particular task, right? So that's something where you think, well, maybe it needs to get specific training, but how could you give it specific training on, every possible, AWS tool? So maybe that's what Amazon is going to do with their model, is they're going to start securing it and training it on all the Amazon tools and things.
Yeah, I think the risk there I would see more with, like, compared to copying from Stack Overflow. I mean, that's everybody does it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. 98% of people do it, and the 2% lie about it. So it's definitely very. But there, at least, you do need to at least maybe do some pattern matching, and there's maybe a step of where you think like, well, yeah, I'm copying from Stack Overflow. But the AI, there's people assume maybe kind of usually incorrectly, that it's smart, and it's not really smart. It's just very, again, it has a very large vocabulary and of things to match against, and it's clever at replacing strings. And so then they think, oh, if the Copilot suggested it, must be right. That's
right, because you're getting to this point where it's so much better than other like code completion things, but it's not quite there where you can really fully trust it. And then it's like, what is the nature of how people are trusting it? Like you're saying, they're going to trust it to write things that could be very expensive queries, or yeah, there's just so many ways that it's hard to kind of balance it works. The things that it's generating are like more and more plausible, but they're not quite at the level where you would like, replace a person with it. Well, not even not quite, but still far, far away from like where you would place a person with it.
Where I find it actually kind of nifty too is in languages that you don't maybe as familiar with or use very frequently, is that at least that it, and maybe don't remember the syntax, because those suggestions will kind of automatically, in particular if you do a comment and said, oh, I want to do this, then it suggests the syntactically correct construct, and then you can go and edit it to your because it's usually obvious what the actual semantics are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I imagine it's really helpful for these, like generating the syntax if you don't remember the syntax, and generating like the arguments in the right order, parameters in the right order. If it's something where you're like, I don't remember like this one versus this one, or like what's the name of this key in the object or something. So it probably knows very well all these different APIs and things that people are using. So it's going to be very helpful in that case.
Noticed in taking data grip, it seems to at least understand some of the schema. So if you ask it like, to do some queries, SQL queries, it sees, or it can get it sees and can substitute against the query or the schema of the database in your current.
Right, because like if you look on, like you were saying before, if on Stack Overflow there's somebody's written kind of a generic example, but in your code you might have these tables and column names and things, and it's going to read previous examples. I wanted to get through these risks though. So the one thing that people don't really seem to know as much about is there's a plugin called Copilot Labs, which is using Copilot but also doing the like explanation. You can highlight some code and it'll generate like a plausible explanation of what's happening. So this is a Python function where I think you might have done this for an interview or something, where you split the text into words by just spaces and then generate like word counts. So here it's identified that I split the text into words, lowercase, count the number of times each word appears in the text. So it describes it pretty well. And it's not just reading, it's not compiling this and doing like a static analysis. It's looking at the actual like variable names they use, or in like larger code bases, it would be looking at the comments and sort of reading that context. And one of the reasons that I think this is risky is suppose they had this code here where I'm multiplying some numbers, and in the meantime, I'm doing something else. I'm importing requests as math, or I'm importing a request function as multiply numbers, and then sending some data to that server. And when I ask Copilot, what's happening here, it says, it recognizes all the things that I called out in the comments or the variable names, and it doesn't say anything about this person did a really weird import at the beginning of the file, and it doesn't say anything about this person sent your stuff somewhere, and it doesn't say someone called a variable safe IP. Just like what's the proof that that's a safe IP address, right? So this, I should also say this, the explanations are using the sampling. So if you click Ask Copilot, it'll generate lots of different explanations. Each explanation will be different each time. So you won't get the exact same thing that I got, and like there's only like a certain % chance that you'll get this message versus a message where they do say something about the request library. But in my experience, if you're covering it well enough, it doesn't mention the request library, partially because it's probably trained on GitHub code, but then maybe also some like more standard code. It hasn't seen a lot of examples where someone does something malicious or very out of the ordinary like this, right? Whereas if a human were looking at this, they would say, even if they don't know very much about what's going on in the code, they'd say, just from the first, like from request import post is multiply numbers, they're like, I don't understand why you're doing that, right? Like rather than the model saying, I don't know what's going on here. This is very strange. It sort of just keeps on trucking and, you know, tries to come up with an explanation. So if you're a Python coder, obviously you look at this and you're like, this is very strange. But like you were saying, if you're doing this in another language where you're less familiar with, or you found this code on Stack Overflow and you're like, what does it do? The code explanation that you get back from Copilot is probably not going to recognize if someone was careful about how they crafted their malicious code, or if they wrote a comment saying this is totally safe. The explanation tool is not going to like parse that code and understand what it's doing. It's going to say, oh, I see what you're, it's going to sort of assume that it's being told the truth about what each line of this code does. Does that make sense? Yeah, following GPS blindly into buildings. Basically, that is basically this sort of thing, because if you don't know what you're doing and think, oh, this has an explanation tool, the explanation tool assumes that you're getting like trustworthy code in the first place, and it doesn't look out for something like this. So I think the right thing to do would be to sort of measure the surprisal or very low probability of you doing some of these lines in the first place, and then sort of flag those lines as being very different from anything that it's seen before in like the regular code base, if that makes sense. And one reason this is so hard to do, where I don't think they can just immediately solve this, is we talked about forever ago, earlier in the slides, that it's going from first to last through the words. So if you start a file and there's nothing in the file, you have no idea the probability what the first word is going to be. And then if I write import, you're like, well, I don't know what library you're going to import. Import requests. Okay, that's normal. Import request as. Okay, that's normal. And then it's only, but you don't actually know if the person's going to write import request as R or RQ or REQ, or basically there's a lot of possible things that could even follow this, where you don't want to make an assumption that you know what they're going to import their libraries as without this context. And so that's why somebody's able to get away with something where they would, the probability of somebody writing this versus the probability of them writing a more normal, like import requests as REQ, is so early in the file, it's very difficult for them to tell. So one thing that I'm considering as an option is maybe you could use, there's something called AST where you could like rearrange the, could parse and rearrange the Python code, where like after you've seen the actual function, you're like, does it make sense for me to import requests to do this? And then the another option is there's Facebook, or Meta as they're called, has a model called Encoder, where they can, you can place a marker inside of your code, like in the middle or at the beginning of your code, and then it'll try to generate that later. So maybe there's some way you could strategically place markers in the code and then figure out whether that matched what, like whether those things early on in your code are code as you'd expect it to be written. But I don't think there's a lot of research on this. And I mean, this, I have to say this is similar to what you said about copying from Stack Overflow, because everyone tells you don't copy from Stack Overflow, so eventually it's going to burn you. And in this case, you know, almost every time that you get code and ask it to explain it, it's going to be normal code and explain it properly. But if someone obfuscates it a little bit, then you're going to be in for a rough time if you don't like actually think for yourself, is this code doing what I expect it to do? Yeah, then the second one, I mentioned earlier that prompt engineering is like complete this code, or like giving the instruction and then giving it some code and asking it to do something. Like complete this code or convert this to Python or something. So when Google and Anthropic have been trying to make their own code models, they found that the best way to do the prompt is not to show it even just really good examples of code, but to start with, I'm an expert Python programmer, or I've tested this function myself, so I know it's correct. This person responds. If you say, I am a math tutor, then it'll get math questions more accurate. So you're sort of like these prompts can also, rather than being like examples of good answers, they can be more like affirmations for the model, where you're like telling it, like, I'm an expert Python programmer. I will complete the code correctly. And this is kind of cool that people discovered this, but it's also like, I thought this was a science. Like, what if the model is actually really good at generating code and we just haven't found like the right affirmation or something to convince it to generate the best possible answer? So this is just one of those weird things that hasn't really been sorted out about code generation models yet.
Yeah, Nick, I'm going to write a book now. I'm going to write code affirmations.
Code affirmations. I mean, it should exist anyway for us
It
humans
should.
anyway. One thing that's weird about prompts is, because I'm an expert Python programmer, at least as an affirmation has some kind of, like, from context, you're like, oh, if someone wrote that in their comments or the Stack Overflow, they're probably right. In this math proof paper, Zero Shot was like when they didn't write a prompt. They only got it right 18% of the time. But if they said, let's think step by step, that was the best answer. And that makes sense, right? Let's think step by step. And then the next best was first, and then a bullet point. So basically, these prompts are more like imitating what they think a good answer should look like. And then the model is like, okay, yeah, I'm going to finish this answer with that same kind of flow. And this is another example of, you would really have to search for what the right prompt is to get your code model to generate good code, and then not prompting the model is its own choice, which is going to be the least, possibly very far lower quality. So I'm very concerned about, like, how do we find what the right prompts are? And it's hard to really know. I mean, it makes sense that this is maybe something that your elementary school teacher taught you when you were in math classes, to do everything step by step. So maybe humans are like that too, but it's a little bit like, I don't know. It's getting to this edge of, like, it's not really scientific. It's more like someone found the right thing to convince the model that it's doing the right thing, or that's going to give a good answer. And one thing that worries me about this in the code world is, I mean, not everybody does this, but there are a lot of companies and a lot of licenses and a lot of cases where you have the beginning of your code not be, I'm an expert Python programmer, but your copyright, your name, your code license, the so-called header comment. And so these are examples using using GitHub Copilot, where I said, well, what's the name of my hometown? And I've only changed the name of the supposed author of this code. And GitHub Copilot is like, oh yeah, I know where you're from, which is like not a great thing to do. I mean, you might say, well, what is GitHub Copilot supposed to do in this case? Like, should it say everybody is from Chicago? I don't have like a solid answer for this. What I'm trying to say though is GitHub Copilot is reading your header comment to figure out when you wrote this code, who you are, what license you used. And when it starts writing the file, that's like all that it knows about this piece of code. And it's not really easy to say what the prompt is of you being this person, like how that affects the code downstream. And because we know language models can be biased, I think that there could be some real concerns here that it's reading who you are in the header comment and make some assumptions. Yeah.
I don't know, personally, I find that kind of clever, and I would be in some kind of flattered, like, wow, that's kind of like, so it recognized that. I don't know. I mean,
these people aren't necessarily, these are names that people could be from a lot of places, and sort of you're exploring that probability space. What I would say about this is that I do have a lot of examples where I just tried to do like a very basic coding problem, and everybody got valid programs back. So I don't have anything suggesting that the quality of your code that you get from Copilot is going to be affected by them identifying you in a particular way. But also, I think that I don't have the resources to investigate this on a massive scale, like to try hundreds of names and hundreds of code examples. And I agree with what you're saying, that I have put it with, by asking it for your favorite food or your hometown, I am deliberately like pushing the trolley or whatever you want to think. I'm deliberately pushing the question where I'm like, is Copilot going to generate different answers for these people?
See, the
And
interesting question there, I would say, like, because of having done quite a bit with like anonymization and really being and PII redacting, and then for AI modeling, which is a very kind of hope an important subject. The interesting question here would be, right? Do they mask it and then insert a class, because that's can be quite useful. So in this case, like, oh, it's a city, and ideas. Oh well, basically, and then make something up, as opposed to,
yeah. I mean, I think that in the training, it's reading the header comments, and even if you anonymize the header comment, there are a lot of people who host their websites on GitHub pages, right? So it's seeing a lot of English text content and other language text content as well. So I think that you could make an effort to, maybe when someone sends you a prompt, to remove things that are formatted like names or formatted like header comments entirely. To avoid like drawing from that to make your conclusion. But yeah, I think there should be some interest in anonymizing it, or having some kind of benchmark where you say, we tested it against all the names and it's making assumptions about you as a person, but it's not making assumptions about you as a coder. So it's not affecting the like actual use of this tool. But I don't have, I would say that I don't have like any real, like, I don't have like a lot of tests to really show anything about this. So I'm not making like crazy allegations or anything. I don't want to like do like red alert, they're doing this to you or anything. What I'm saying though is it is reading your header comment. Like it is trying to find something out about you when you're writing the code. And I don't think we have a solid answer for what that means. And it would be better if, like you were saying, they did some a little layer of anonymization or some more attempt at that. Yeah, so I think this is basically what I said. I have some generic examples where, you know, I think they do some random sampling. So every time the code that I get is a bit different, but we're getting correct outputs. And I would like to see it run against like all of the leak code problems and lots of different names. And before I start like making any kind of conclusions about this, but it is something that I definitely didn't think about until, you know, I was thinking of like, what are some things that we can test the code prompt. And this is the final one, is searching for adversarial comments. GPT-3 and GitHub Copilot are up in the cloud, so I can't really download it and examine what's going on like in the previous examples. So there's a model called CodeParrot, which is from HuggingFace, and you can download a small version of the model. It's also trained on a lot of code from GitHub, and really good way to kind of test things out. And then once you have something working there, test it out on the larger models. So I thought about lots of different things that you could do, but then the way I boiled down my question into one simple, like choosing this word versus this other word, was when I write a SQL query using PsychoPG2, does it write the SQL query using a plus, or does it use it doing the %s? And because if you're not familiar, if you just add SQL, if you add user strings together to make SQL, someone could write their own SQL into your database and cause lots of problems. So you're supposed to use the %s for it to be escaped. So, oh yeah, I have a slide about this. I used the encoder to try to generate some comments that would trigger it to do one thing or another. But in any case, what I did was I had this example of the SQL queries, and then measuring the probability that it would choose to add versus fill it in. I came up with some comments on my own, and then it was like, what if I looked at all of these different code terms to figure out what shifts the probability the most? So the leading tokens that move you more towards the SQL injection risky code are a lot of punctuation, so like quotes and backslashes and things. And then I was kind of surprised by these SVG, ArcPy, GNU plot, and GData. And my leading theory for these is that either they're in like older Python code, or ArcPy, for anyone who does geospatial stuff, ArcPy is like a desktop GIS mapping library. So my guess is a lot of people who write ArcPy in their code are running something where they wouldn't have to worry about SQL injections so much. So I almost think that sort of the sneakiest comment to kind of poison the rest of the file towards being vulnerable to SQL injections might just be comments that suggest that this is running internally, or that it's an older code or something like that. And even if that's not the case, if you can get the probability of generating SQL injections to like 10%, then you're in trouble, right? Because out of 100 people copy that code and start using it, then 10 of them are going to be doing that. But really the main thing that I found so far is that if you've already written like if you've already written vulnerable code into your model, then it will try to copy that. Like the huge difference between whether it sees no previous examples, a previous example where you inserted the SQL correctly, or a previous example where you did it in this insecure way. Like it'll try to copy what it sees. But then if there's nothing to copy it from, you have a little bit of flexibility where someone could write a comment that looks like it's about something unrelated, but actually increases the probability of you getting Copilot to generate something insecure. Or in this case, it's CodeParrot. Sorry, yeah, this makes CodeParrot generate less secure code, but there is a risk that similar things could exist, or similar prompts could work on Copilot. So because I don't know everything that could be a prompt, I've created a interactive on HuggingFace Spaces. This is like a free Python GUI thing where people can test things out on models. So if you're a Python coder and not a web coder, and you want to get into machine learning models, you can write your UI like this, and it'll create a form like this. And so this is the thing that I've written for people to test their own risk of SQL injections. So I have a leaderboard somewhere where I'm keeping track of these. People can write a header comment. They can write a comment just before the cur to execute function. They can decide if they want type hints. They can decide if there's a previous example. And then I will return the probability that it's going to return something with a plus instead of composition. So yeah, I think this is really interesting that somebody could, for free, throw something out on the web, and people can try to defeat the model, and we have a leaderboard of what is causing the model to mess up, and then that sort of is leading to some sort of intelligence towards, okay, based on models that are trained on GitHub, this is a comment that will steer them in the wrong direction, if that makes sense. And then recap, I think we talked about this many times, is that we should investigate how machine learning really works before just accepting the suggestions. Compare it to the security level of finding bash commands and code on the internet. I would like there to be more benchmarks to sort of test out, what really is, maybe some models are already trained to prevent creating these kind of SQL injection vulnerable code. Like, I think it would be good to test them on benchmarks and detect biases and things like that. And if you're just getting started and this sounds intimidating, like, sorry, this is like a very niche topic that I'm talking about. Things that I would recommend are scikit-learn, mini-torch, and simple transformers. I've contributed code to simple transformers, so I always love using it. And those are really good places to start. Great. So for the Q&A, yeah, so this is the end. Thank you.
Yeah, this has been awesome.
But yeah, I have a lot of Q&A to catch up on.
I think there's, well, yeah, let me scroll back as well.
I guess for the regulatory reasons, I think that I was impressed to learn that there's any work environment that's already talked about, don't use Copilot, it's going to steal your data, because I don't want to make accusations like that, but if people have checked that option to use my code suggestions, if you're using code completion, it's sending every line of code as you write it to look for suggestions. I'm impressed that people are having that conversation, because I've never had anybody at work ask me, they've just been like, oh, we've heard about this cool Copilot thing, right? So I definitely think that that's a good policy if you have a secure work environment, and then otherwise it should be treated the same way as like Stack Overflow. I don't think there's like a government thing.
So Felix, do they allow Stack Overflow copy and paste?
Oh, of course. I think it is more. It's more just the source code getting out, right?
Yeah.
Canada.
No, I guess I should learn if there are more places that do that.
Well, I also think that the risk, there would be a risk of someone just taking code without really understanding it. Again, obviously, there's code reviews and everything still, but it.
And what I want to stress about that is not that people are taking the code without understanding it because they're like underqualified or something, but because it's very easy. It's very easy. Like, just like you would just do tab to complete your code if it looks right. Like, if they say, I'm going to write this for loop for you, that saves me a small amount of time, but it saves me, from having to actually go through this repetitive process. And so for the same reasons that it's very convenient and helpful, it's also very easy to forget that you're supposed to check it. And so I do think that even people who are very experienced could just kind of like tab through something in this particular case.
Yeah.
Any consideration on whether the code and training set has test coverage? It's, I think, almost everything that's on GitHub. So hopefully you've been committing tests to your code. I think it would be tricky to do if you I'm more familiar with like a Rails project sometimes, where I guess this is true for Python as well. You have the tests in one place in one completely different file and directory from the actual code. It's not reading your whole repo. You send it text and it tries to complete. So I think that it would be difficult for it to generate good tests for you if you have like a big mono repo where the tests and the code are in different places. How is it going to know what your variable names are? Databanks trusted by Copilot are corrupted. There's an idea of like data poisoning, where if someone really wanted to, maybe they're deliberately posting malicious code on GitHub. Or kind of the example that I would give is, what if every time they post malicious code, what if every time they post very toxic text, they also every time they post like text on Twitter or something, they write a hashtag like #butterflies. And so the model will say, oh, this person's cool, and they use #butterflies, and it's never toxic. But then one day they decide to become toxic and they use the same hashtag. The model's like, I've never seen any of this other stuff before, but I've seen this hashtag before and it's cool. So it's not going to be toxic. Like, you could poison the system with like false signals, but I think you would have to have like a very diabolical time scale, especially with like you're against all the other code on GitHub. Maybe you could have like a nonce or UUID, but I mean, is GitHub, and then if GitHub memorizes that it could like memorize certain things about you and what you want your code to look like. But I'm trying to think of examples where just sort of an ordinary person using GitHub Copilot could be tricked either into thinking that code is like not vulnerable, or generating. This is basically somebody is this is like the crown jewel, right? Somebody generating some kind of comment that looks benign but makes your Copilot like generate some crazy code or prompt or something. And I'm sure that it's out there. It's just, you know, you don't have direct access to the model to mess with it. Can Copilot do code grading? I think that maybe GPT-3, because they've seen more human text, could maybe like evaluate whether you wrote good code or not. But then GitHub, it's just the code. There's very few places where it's like the code and then like someone saying this was good or this was bad. Maybe you could like do something with the data from all the pull requests that have ever been done. I think that would be really interesting to see. Like, if you looked at enough pull requests, could you immediately respond to pull requests with like a accept reject or like something like that? Comparing it to other pull requests. I think it would be cool if there's like bots that were learning how to maintain a repo like that. Example of grading code. Positive text meant to influence. Can you explain kind of your question about the?
Yeah, Jackie, if you want to expand on that.
Sorry, I was just wondering, you know, even for a political campaign, can somebody post stuff that, I mean, when it's coding, not so much, but could somebody just post something that looks really benign and is meant to sway an engine one way or another? I mean, and I mean, obviously that can happen, but are there measures being considered against stuff like that? I mean, good code, bad code, let's sabotage this particular thing that's happening, whether it's a piece of code or, you know, the news media or something. And we know that's out there. I'm just wondering, what are the countermeasures, if you know what I mean?
I think kind of something that other people have, I'm sure, talked about before in terms of the like recommendation models. If you Facebook has a new like chatbot called BlenderBot, and so I've talked to BlenderBot about like movies and food and travel and things. Someone on Twitter went to the bot and said, "Do you know any new conspiracy theories?" And the bot had some very interesting theories for all of us. And so that's you're sort of finding a word, something where I guess that's sort of prompting the bot to go in that direction. But there is a risk that because the model has seen the whole internet, that by like inviting it to go to that place, you're kind of asking it to take up that content. In terms of positive uses or like a political thing, I think it would be really helpful for, I had this thing with the New York City bot was I would ask it how to get from one place to another, and it was just using like an Uber or a taxi or something. And it said something negative about public transit, I want to say. I can't remember exactly what happened, but I thought that should be part of like the model affirmations, is something about, you know, if you can get there by public transit and you're not in a hurry, it's better for the environment for you to, I guess, rough crowd, Indianapolis, talking about public transit. But in the New York example, I think that you could have a lot of positive affirmations that encourage people, like if they ask about conspiracy theories, be like, hey, you know, I don't really like to talk about that. There are people who've created something called WOE-bot, WOE bot, that's supposed to be like a cognitive behavioral therapist, CBT, I want to say. So there's people have definitely tried to put these in positive places, and I don't want to discourage that. I think there's just though this fear of, you know, if you left something specified, then it might, give people bad medical advice or something, where then you've opened yourself up to legal liability, but also you're like, why did I create this bot into the world that doesn't know this could be harmful? Let's see. I haven't read this thing about ML for code, but this is like a research thing about repairing bugs. I think that would be really cool.
Yeah, you were just saying, like, could you detect bugs, from bug fixes, or vice versa? Like, what are some bug fixes? I really like this ML for code. It was basically like a research paper in 2018 doing like a survey, and then they kind of kept that updated with like what's the latest and greatest of like source code, like learning and stuff like that. So just kind of cool of like, hey, can we do like automated pull request review, or stuff like that. So like pretty interesting examples there.
That's cool. Really cool. Any other questions for Nick? This has been really awesome. It's been a great discussion. I'm glad that there was a lot of interactivity and a lot of folks participated, because I think it was really worthwhile to kind of get those questions that we've all had in our back of our head answered about this, or at least discussed and brought out into the open. Answers might be a strong word.